Many scholars have argued that without the fiery sermons of Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield, there wouldn't even be a United States of America. Why? Well, because it turns out the Great Awakening came at just the right time. It unified the colonies and turned them to God just before the American Revolution. In fact, many clergymen led colonial fighting units and urged their men to fight for the glory of God. This is Plymouth Rock at Pilgrim Memorial State Park in Plymouth, Massachusetts. This park was created in 1920 to celebrate the 300th anniversary of the Pilgrims' landing here. Traditionally, this unassuming rock marks the spot where the Christian story of North America first began. The Pilgrims intended to land in Virginia, but the Mayflower was blown off course here to Massachusetts. With the weather too dangerous to keep sailing, the captain insisted they make landfall. One of their leaders, William Bradford, wrote this. Being thus arrived in a good harbor and brought safe to land, they fell upon their knees and blessed the God of heaven, who had brought them over the vast and furious ocean and delivered them from all the perils and miseries thereof. Last and not least, they cherished a great hope and inward zeal of laying good foundations for the propagation and advance of the gospel of the kingdom of Christ in the remote parts of the world. This painting, The Embarkation of the Pilgrims, still hangs in the U.S. Capitol Rotunda in Washington, D.C. It proudly and prominently depicts the first pilgrims kneeling in prayer to God. This is Plymouth Plantation. It's a living museum created in 1947, which attempts to reproduce the original settlement established by the Pilgrims here in the 1620s. With no king-appointed person on board the Mayflower with authority to take charge of Plymouth Colony, the Pilgrims gave themselves authority and created their own government. They wrote the Mayflower Compact. We whose names are underwritten, having undertaken for the glory of God and advancement of the Christian faith and the honor of our king and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia, do by these presents solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and one another, covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic. Contrary to what our history books might tell us today, Puritan Christians came to the New World with a distinctly Christian vision for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith. When King James died in 1625, his son Charles I took over the British throne. Charles had the arrogance of a Roman emperor, and tyranny, torture, and religious persecution soon followed. As a result, tens of thousands of liberty-loving Christians followed the example of the Plymouth Pilgrims and crossed the Atlantic Ocean. Together, they laid the foundation for the most biblically based, freedom-loving nation in the world. It was a grand experiment where pastors and their churches actually planted the colonial settlements. They included the Reverend Roger Williams in Providence, Rhode Island, the Reverend John Wheelwright in Exeter, New Hampshire, the Reverend Thomas Hooker in Hartford, Connecticut, and the Reverend John Cotton in Boston, Massachusetts. This is Boston, the capital of Massachusetts. Founded in 1630, it's one of the oldest cities in the United States. Boston is also home to the Freedom Trail, a 2.5-mile walking route through a number of historical sites that tell the story of America's founding. I'm at Boston Common, considered the start of the Freedom Trail. Established in 1634, this is America's oldest public park, where Puritan colonists would graze their livestock on what was considered common land. Like the Pilgrims of Plymouth, the Puritans of Boston were also motivated by a Christian purpose in coming to the New World. In fact, the comparison of Christian America being a city on a hill for the rest of the world to see comes from a sermon delivered here in 1630 by a pastor named John Winthrop. The Lord will be our God, and delight to dwell among us and his own people, and will command a blessing upon us in all our ways, so that we shall see much more of his wisdom, power, goodness, and truth than formerly we have been acquainted with. For we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us, so that if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword through the world. Another stop along the Freedom Trail is King's Chapel, which was founded in 1686 as Boston's first Anglican church. This stone structure was built in 1754 on the church's original site. The interior of King's Chapel is considered the finest example of Georgian architecture in North America. This church also houses the oldest American pulpit, still in continuous use. Each of the American colonies was distinctly Christian in purpose, vision, and culture. Their civil charters, legal systems, and political covenants were unapologetically Christian. Nobody disputed that America was founded on a commitment to Jesus Christ and to represent his kingdom as a shining city on a hill. But as generations passed, the religious conviction that led many to the New World began to fade, and church leaders across the colonies, particularly here in New England, began to worry about the declining Christian influence among the lives of the colonists. But just as pastors delivered grave warnings, a sudden Christian revival broke out, swept across entire communities, and dramatically reshaped the cultural dynamics of the New World. It became known as the Great Awakening. This is the Old South Meeting House, the largest building in colonial Boston, and the stage for some of the most dramatic events leading up to the American Revolution. Built as a Puritan meeting place in 1729, the Old South Meeting House stands today as one of the nation's most important colonial sites. Old South became a center for public protests against British actions in colonial Boston. It was also a hub for revival preaching. George Whitefield was born in Britain in 1714. He was an Anglican pastor who studied at Oxford. There he worked in ministry with the Wesley brothers and became one of the founders of Methodism and the evangelical movement. In 1740, Whitefield trekked to North America to be a preacher. He was a powerful speaker who drew large audiences. During his lifetime, it's said that he preached to nearly 10 million people at thousands of revival meetings, a significant catalyst for the First Great Awakening in North America. Jonathan Edwards was another important figure during this period. Rooted in the Puritan heritage, Edwards was a Congregationalist preacher, widely regarded as one of America's most influential theologians. Along with George Whitefield, Edwards played a critical role in shaping the Great Awakening, writing pamphlets and leading revivals from his church in Massachusetts. In 1741, just after Whitefield completed his revival tour of all 13 colonies, Jonathan Edwards delivered his famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, which not only inspired a generation of Christians, but it went on to be a classic in American literature. Many scholars have argued that without the fiery sermons of Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield, there wouldn't even be a United States of America. Why? Well, because it turns out the Great Awakening came at just the right time. It unified the colonies and turned them to God just before the American Revolution. In fact, many clergymen led colonial fighting units and urged their men to fight for the glory of God. One of my favorite stories from this period in American history happened south of here in Virginia. The story of the Patriot pastor, John Peter Muhlenberg. On January 21st, 1776, at the Lutheran Church in Woodstock, Virginia, Pastor Muhlenberg preached from the 3rd chapter of Ecclesiastes, which starts, "To everything there is a season." After reading the 8th verse, "a time of war and a time of peace," he declared, "And this is the time of war." He then threw off his clerical robe to reveal the uniform of a Continental Army colonel. You see, Pastor Muhlenberg also had a military background, and George Washington had personally asked him to raise and command the 8th Virginia Regiment of the Continental Army. Outside the church, drums began to roll as the men in the congregation turned to kiss their wives and then walked down the aisle of the church to enlist. Within a half hour, 162 men had joined the 8th Virginia Regiment and marched on to fight for their country's independence. After the Revolutionary War, the Patriot pastor John Muhlenberg went on to serve the new republic in both the U.S. Senate and House of Representatives. Now, that's an American story of faith and freedom.